Okay. Hi, guys. So thanks for joining us today. My name is Courtney Wold. I am a marriage and family therapist associate, and today we're going to be talking about mandated reporter training. So I know everybody at Youth for Christ goes through mandated reporter training when they get hired, but we're going to go into just a little bit more detail today. We're going to go through some situations about what would require a mandated report, and then also how to specifically make a mandated report. Okay. Here's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So breakdown of training. We're going to do a little bit of background about why we make mandated reports, a little bit about child abuse and neglect. We're going to talk about who is a mandated reporter and what is their role. We're going to be talking about the effects of abuse and neglect on children, types of abuse and neglect that must be reported and qualifies as a mandated report, how to make a report, what are some other reporting circumstances that maybe aren't as typically seen or talked about. And then we're going to do some final wrap up and final discussion at the end. So learning objectives, hopefully this is what everybody will be getting out of our training today. So you, as an employee for Youth for Christ, will understand your role as a mandated reporter. You will also be able to identify different types of child abuse, neglect, and what are maybe some warning signs, what are some red flags, what are some common things to look for, how to respond and how to talk to a child who might disclose to you that they are being abused or are experiencing neglect. What are some of the steps to take when making a report, and understanding special circumstances that require reporting but do not necessarily fall under the definition of abuse in the California Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act. So that's also known as CANRA. All right, so let's jump in. So just a little bit of background for child abuse and neglect reporting. In 1980, the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act was passed. You can actually find it online. I list at the end some resources for you guys to go through, but you can actually go and look up all of the specific penal codes in California that talks about definitions, procedures for reporting suspected abuse, and protections, as well as liabilities for mandated reporters. So all of the penal codes actually list like specific procedures. They probably would answer any questions that you might have. It's going to be a lot more specific about what more specific than what we're talking about today. But basically this training comes from a lot from that website. Okay, so we'll be basically summarizing exactly what the CANRA website talks about. So remember that as a mandated reporter, you must make a child report whenever the mandated reporter, in his or her professional capacity or within the scope of his or her employment, has knowledge or observes a child whom the mandated reporter knows or reasonably suspects has been the victim of child abuse or neglect. Okay, and we're going to jump into that statement in way more detail here in a little bit. All right, so stay tuned. Okay, so what qualifies a person to be a mandated reporter, right? So in California, professionals who work with children as part of their job typically are required to go through specific training and requirements to be what's considered a mandated reporter. Okay, so you can actually find a whole list of every profession that requires employees to be mandated reporters on the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act website as well. There's actually over 40 professions listed, and that list is actually still growing. So typical professions that you might see would be teachers, doctors, physicians, mentors, therapists, counselors, and pretty much any school staff members, right? So a lot of professions that are around children and might be, kind of have that trusting relationship with them as well. Mandated reporters play a key role in detecting and helping abused children due to the extent of their relationship and environment. So keeping in mind that, again, a lot of these professions are working with children multiple days a week, working with children kind of in a one-on-one setting. If you're a counselor, if you're a mentor, sometimes like tutors or teachers, right? Doctors, physicians. That kind of gives you, as you build that relationship, especially if you're seeing a child more than one day a week or once a week, or you're working with them for an extended period of time, this gives the mandated reporter a little bit more insight and kind of a better chance to observe what's going on in the child's life. And you might even, notice some changes or appear like in the child's appearance or behavior, that other people might typically not notice, right? So a counselor who works with a student, one day a week for an hour one-on-one might start to notice that there's some changes going on, where a teacher, in a high school class who only works with the student for 45 minutes in a group of 30 kids, might not notice those changes going on. So sometimes, just depending on your relationship and the contact that you have with that kid, you might have a little bit more insight to their relationship and what's going on in their lives. Okay, so what exactly does a mandated reporter do? Like, what is their role? Why are we required to be mandated reporters if we're working with kids? So the role of a mandated reporter is to report observed, reported, or suspected child abuse and neglect, right? So that statement right there sounds pretty simple, sounds pretty straightforward, but actually it's not. It kind of, sometimes it can get a little bit muddy. It's not always black or white. And sometimes we don't always know what to do or how to respond or what exactly needs to be reported. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail as the training goes on. But in a nutshell, that's kind of our role as mandated reporters, right? Is to report observed, reported, or suspected abuse or neglect. So oftentimes people ask, right, what does reasonable suspicion of abuse mean? So basically, if you suspect abuse, in a child, or if a child is showing up with certain things that is questionable and you're not exactly sure what's going on, make a child abuse report, right? If you suspect that there's something going on that's not normal for the kid, that they're being injured in some sort of way, call the Child Protective Services Agency, right? We are still required to make a report even if we don't have proof, right? We do not need to have proof that abuse has occurred. We do not need to investigate, right? Like, we don't need to be asking questions. We don't have to know exactly what's going on, right? We don't want to intimidate children either by doing that. So you can still make a report. You're still required to make a report. Any type of investigation or proof can be determined by child welfare professionals or law enforcement, right? So people, the social workers or the law enforcement officers are trained in a specific way to investigate, where it won't be as traumatizing to a child. They know how to ask questions. They know how to investigate. They know if there's been previous reports made in the past. They know if they have a case. They know exactly how to work with the family. So keeping in mind that even if we just have that suspicion of abuse, we still need to make the report, and it is not our job to investigate or to gather proof in order to do that. So why is it important, that we make these reports? Like, why is it important that we are mandated reporters? Why do these things have to be reported, right? And so we're going to talk just briefly about the effects of abuse and neglect for children. Honestly, this is a topic that you can probably do a whole nother training on that I'm only going to cover in 2 slides today. So keep that in mind a little bit, as we're talking through this. It can get a lot more complicated, and there's other things going on sometimes, but for the sake of time today, we're going to just kind of keep it brief. So why do we make reports? So children who experience abuse or neglect are at higher risk for health problems that continue on even into adulthood, right? So you probably, might hear down the pipeline, or might have already heard of, the adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, right? That's becoming a more and more talked about topic. And the reason for that is because adverse childhood experiences influence the health and well-being of children that last throughout their lifespan. Right. And so you might be asking, okay, so what exactly are ACEs? What exactly are these adverse childhood experiences? So that is anything that potentially can be traumatic, any potential traumatic event that has a negative or long lasting effect on health and well-being. right? So I've listed several examples here, but basically there's more. It can be anything that potentially is traumatic that happens during childhood. So reoccurrent physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, alcohol or drug abuser living in the home. Maybe a household member is incarcerated, right? Somebody with a chronologic illness or mental illness in the home, domestic violence, separation from biological parents. There's tons more. Again, we're just going to kind of briefly cover this information. So again, it's just important to know that this is why we report. Like, this is our job. This is our duty as mandated reporters, is to protect children, because the sooner that there are intervention, the sooner that we can start kind of potentially working through some of these potentially traumatic events, right? And then children will have, a more successful adulthood if early intervention is found. So some things that you might notice, right, that also come along with the effects of abuse and neglect for children: anxiety, depression, other mental health effects. Children, might have some self-abusive behaviors, right? So you might notice like cutting, self-harming, suicidal gestures, attempts, thoughts, right, ideation. Children might experience low self-esteem. You might notice that they are either clingy or very, very unattached, from adults, peers, mentors, teachers, parents, guardians, anything like that. Or they might be overly clingy with those adult figures, or peers. You might notice that they can tend to act hostile, aggressive, verbally abusive towards others. You might notice delinquent behavior, running away from home, use of alcohol or drugs, especially at a young age. That's not typically appropriate for that developmental level, right? Academic or behavioral problems in school. You might notice that they have actually a really hard time making friends, or they have really inappropriate boundaries with friends at school, with peers at school, right? Or any other significant behavioral changes, right? So that's, again, kind of just in a nutshell, some of the effects that abuse and neglect can have for children. And so that's why it's important for us as mandated reporters, where we have sometimes that trusting relationship with them. We might have a little bit more insight to their lives and what's going on. So that's why it's important that we make these mandated reports, because early intervention is key to help prevent or to help a child cope with some of these things that they might be experiencing. Okay, so we're going to jump into different types of abuse. The types of abuse that are absolute mandated reports we're going to talk about today is physical, sexual, emotional, and neglect. All of those have to be reported if you hear them in any circumstances when you're working with a child. Okay, and we will start with physical abuse. I think typically physical abuse is one of the easiest kind of types of abuse to notice and report. So CANRA defines physical abuse as physical injury inflicted by other than accidental means on a child or intentionally injuring a child, right? So that can be characterized by any physical injury. So anything such as you might notice like bruises, you might notice burns, broken bones for a kid, any of that resulting from hitting, beating, kicking, biting, burning, any type of physically harming a child, right? So keeping in mind, parents might not always intend to hurt their child in that sort of way, right? It might have resulted from an over discipline or inappropriate physical punishment, right? But as mandated reporter, again, it is not our job to do the investigating. It's not our job to find the proof or what was the underlying reason for why the kid got injured, right? Our job is to protect the kiddo from being physically injured. And so in order to do that, we have to make the appropriate mandated report, okay? Keeping in mind too, that sometimes it only happens one time. Maybe there's only a single episode in the home, or sometimes kids can experience it repeatedly, right? There might be repeated episodes in the home. And sometimes that can be really dangerous because it can result in severity from minor bruising to death, right? If it keeps on happening, maybe the parent is getting more and more aggressive. in the home. And so again, that's why it is important for us to go ahead and make a report anytime that we're hearing any type of physical abuse. Sometimes people have a hard time distinguishing like what is typical punishment, right? What is punishment for a child? Does a parent have the right to punish their child? Sure. But keeping in mind that any injury resulting from physical punishment that requires medical treatment is considered outside the realm of normal disciplinary measures, right? And that statement right there might sound a little bit obvious, right? Okay, if a parent injures a kid and it results in a broken bone and they obviously need some medical treatment, that's not typical punishment, right? But also, hitting with an object, hitting in the face, hitting, inappropriately, number of times, things like that, that might not be as obvious because it's not requiring that medical treatment, but it's still defined as physical abuse. Okay. So I want to just briefly kind of talk a little bit about developmental milestones for kids, right? So I used this chart just kind of as an example. I know most of us at Youth for Christ aren't working with infants, but I think that it just makes a good point to keep in mind as we are working with kids, right? Kids go through different developmental stages, and sometimes that comes along with that, right? Different injuries might occur just due to where they're at in their life. So I like this chart because, again, even though we're not dealing with infants, it reminds us that a kiddo who's under the age of 9 months isn't typically walking yet, right? They're not even really typically crawling yet. So in that case, there really shouldn't be any bruises on a kid or any patterned red marks, right? Or any suspicious injuries. Right. And so that typically can kind of cause a little bit of a red flag in the back of our mind that there's something going on. Right. And so that's suspicion, and that would need to be reported. So fast forward to us at Youth for Christ, working with elementary, junior high school kids, right? All in that walking, running, climbing, all the way up to sports kind of stage. What are typical injuries for kids that you might be seeing in that developmental stage? Right. So a high school student, sure, they might be really active in sports, right? So maybe a bruise is typical for them. But again, keeping in mind is that is a kid always getting hurt? Are they continuously reporting that they have, broken bones? That's not typical for a kid being involved in a sport, unless they're really, really aggressively playing like in football or something, right? So things to kind of watch out for, red flags for possible physical abuse. So location of the injury. Again, little kids, right, learning how to ride a bike, they might fall down once, twice, couple times, right? That's typical. That's not abuse, right? But normal bruising for a kiddo would probably be like the knees, shin area, elbows, right? Again, falling from a bike would maybe be skinned knees, bruise on the shin, scraped up elbows. They're not going to have a red pattern across their face, right? They're not going to typically, suspicious bruises might include like on the child's back, on the back of their thighs, that patterned red mark across their face, on their buttocks, in their genital area, those kinds of things. So again, just things to kind of watch out for. Location of the injury, is it suspicious? Is it typical? Think about developmental age of the student. What kind of sports or activities are they involved in? Those kinds of things. Any injury with an improbable explanation, right? Maybe the kid just can't tell you how it happened. Maybe the parent can't tell you how it happened, right? Like maybe you have a relationship with the parent and you're like, "Ooh, I noticed little Johnny had a pretty big bruise like on his face. What happened?" Maybe the parent's kind of stuttering to give you an explanation. Maybe they don't know how to. Those kinds of things. That's suspicious. An injury that is unusual for the child's age. So again, going back to that developmental chart and then thinking about like what age is your child that you're meeting with, what age is the child that you're meeting with, and what is typical for their developmental stage, right? An elementary school student probably isn't involved in aggressive sports such as football, so they shouldn't be having reoccurring injuries of broken arms. History of previous or reoccurrent injuries, right? So again, a kid might fall off the monkey bars. If you're meeting with an elementary student, it happens, right? We hear those stories about those kiddos that break their arm or their leg falling during recess. But if it's something that's continuing to happen at home, especially where nobody else is around, probably a red flag. If a caregiver does not or delays medical attention for a pretty serious injury, right, because maybe they're avoiding that mandated report, or if you hear directly a statement from the child that the injury was a result of abuse, okay? So what are some behavioral warning signs of physical abuse in children, right? What are some things that maybe you're not noticing, right? These bruises, maybe you're not seeing any of these red marks or hearing anything directly from the child, right? You're not seeing the injury. So other things that might indicate that a kiddo is experiencing physical abuse is that they might appear to be kind of like watchful, always looking around, on alert, right? Maybe they're waiting kind of like for something bad to happen. Injuries appear to have a pattern, right? Such as marks from a hand or a belt. So you might notice kind of like that hand mark somewhere on the kiddo's body. That would be considered a pattern. You might notice, right, like a welt that's kind of the shape and size of a belt. That's also considered a pattern, you know, so kind of those patterned injuries or bruises. A kid might, you know, just be super hyper aware of what's going on. They might shy away from somebody trying to touch them or somebody being near them, right? They might flinch at sudden movements, right? Like, ooh, I might get hit. They might be afraid to go home. Also, a kid might wear kind of inappropriate clothing to cover up injuries, right? So such as long sleeve shirts on hot days. You know, if it's like, especially in the Central Valley, if it's 110 degrees outside and you know, the kiddos are going out for recess or whatever, and they're wearing a sweatshirt, you know, that potentially might be an indication. So again, we have to report under reasonable suspect. A kid wearing, you know, a long sleeve shirt, a sweatshirt, even when it's really hot outside, isn't all of a sudden just an indication like, yes, I have to go and make this report, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind, right? Something that just needs to kind of raise a little bit of a red flag and for you to just kind of open your ears a little bit extra and see, hey, what's going on here, right? That's not typical, especially for a younger kid. Adolescents, you know, maybe they have a little bit of, you know, kind of body image things going on. So maybe that's why they're wearing like baggier clothes or, you know, long sleeves, right? Maybe that's something a little bit different, but especially for those younger kiddos, that's something that you just want to have that red flag raise up in the back of your mind. Okay, we're going to go ahead and hop into sexual abuse. So per camera, sexual abuse refers to sexual assault or sexual exploitation as defined by various sections in the California Penal Code. Okay. I think sexual abuse sometimes can be difficult to determine when we need to make a report and when we don't need to, right? So we will talk about that here in a little bit because unlike other forms of abuse, age differences are important when assessing sexual activity, okay? So for now, until we get to the slide of consensual activity between minors, we will kind of just move forward, assuming that that sexual abuse is unwanted sexual act, either coerced, forced, accomplished without the consent of the partner, or any type of adult with a child, okay, type of abuse kind of situation. Okay, so remember that anybody under the age of 18 cannot consent, okay, to sexual activity with an adult. And we'll talk a little bit more about age here in a minute as well. So types of sexual abuse: sexual assault, any types of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient, right? I included several different types of sexual assault, right, to include but not limited to rape, statutory rape, attempted rape, incest, sodomy, oral copulation, fondling or unwanted touching, penetration, molestation, masturbating in the presence of a child. Okay, so all of that would fall under the sexual assault category. So the other area that also still requires a mandated report would be sexual exploitation. Okay, so sexual exploitation occurs when somebody uses power to coerce, manipulate, or deceive a child into sexual activity in exchange for something the victim needs or wants. So any time that there's a person, right, in power, or they're using their power over somebody under the age of 18, it is considered a mandated report. Okay, so forms of sexual exploitation might include, and again, not limited to, but typically seen at prostitution of children, child pornography, and sex trafficking, right? As we're starting to learn a little bit more and more about sex trafficking as well, it's becoming a little bit more of a topic, especially in our community. So children in exploitative situations and relationships often receive some money, gifts, basic needs, or affection as a result. And so again, using that power to kind of say, hey, if you do this for me, you know, in return, you're going to get your basic needs, right? That's it. That's exploitation. So warning signs of sexual abuse in children. So what to kind of look for, what are some behaviors that you might notice? Again, if they're not disclosing to you or they're not telling you that this is going on, right? So they might have trouble walking or sitting, displays knowledge or interest in sexual acts. That's, again, think about that developmental model. So what is inappropriate for their age, right? Especially in younger kids or adolescents, right? Sometimes you might notice some seductive behaviors. They might make strong efforts to avoid a specific person without a specific reason. They don't want to change clothes in front of other people or participate in physical activities. They might be reporting an STD or pregnancies, especially under the age of 14. That probably would be sexual abuse. They might be running away from home, right? If the person who they're experiencing the abuse from is in the home. So again, a kid that runs away from home or a kid that is avoiding this one person at school, right, isn't necessarily, oh my gosh, this kid is experiencing sexual abuse because they don't want to go home or they don't want to be around that person. But again, it's just kind of that little red flag in the back of your mind that needs to be raised and say, okay, well, why are they acting this way? Why are they scared to go home? Like, why do they not want to be around that person? You know, is it they're just not comfortable or is there actually something going on, right? So just some things to keep in mind with sexual abuse. So sometimes kids might disclose right away, but just remember that most victims of sexual abuse report the crime or crimes months or even years after it occurred. Sometimes they might not even report it at all, right? Also keep in mind, right, as you're meeting with these children, it's also common for children to change their story. Right. So sometimes they might disclose the abuse, right? They might feel guilty afterward. They might realize, oh, shoot, you know, I made a mistake. They might feel shame. They might feel embarrassed. They might feel scared of what might happen to the person who abused them. Right. And so it's common and for a kid to retract their statement or to kind of change their story. Right. But it's important for us as mandated reporters to recognize this, because even if they retract what they said, or if they kind of try to make a little cover up or haha, that was a joke, children rarely fabricate these accounts. So therefore, we need to keep in mind that the report still needs to be made, right? All statements made by children need to be taken seriously. Okay. Okay, so reporting consensual activities between minors. So this is the section that always gets fun. And I did actually have Christy send you guys a handout on this because it was something that I received when I started grad school. And it was really, really helpful for me because it specifically highlights which situations need to be a mandated report and which ones don't when it comes to consensual sexual activity with minors, okay? So keep in mind that remembering that any forced, coerced, or non-consensual sexual activity is always a mandated report. Doesn't matter the age of the students. It could be a 16-year-old girlfriend with her 16-year-old boyfriend. If it's not consensual, it is always a mandated report, okay? And again, that goes back to all of those other activities. It's not just sex that's reportable, okay? Also keep in mind in California, if there is consensual activity between two like-aged minors that involves acts of sodomy, oral copulation, or sexual penetration with a foreign object, existing law requires that a child abuse report must be made. So this is a law that they actually recently kind of put under the spotlight because it is seen now as discriminatory towards the LGBTQ population. So keep in mind that while this is an existing law in California, it is under the microscope and it is looking to be changed. But for now, it doesn't matter the age. If you hear of any type of penetration other than vaginal, you must make a mandated report. Okay. Jumping into ages, right? So again, there's a more thorough explanation of basically what I was able to put into this slide today, in that guideline that I emailed you guys, or I had Christy email you. Okay, but basically in a nutshell, sexual conduct of a person under 14 years old with an older person has to be reported. Okay, so 14 years old is kind of that age. Anyone older than 14 that has a relationship with somebody under the age of 14, that would be considered a mandated report. CANRA does not specify at what age a child is able to consent, right, to sexual activities with a person their similar age. So, but you as, a mandated reporter has to just kind of use your best judgment and say, okay, so this kid, they're 12, they're having, sexual relationships with their 12-year-old partner, right? Maybe that's not necessarily a mandated report, but maybe this 12-year-old is clearly not developmentally ready for that, right? Maybe there's a learning disability, or maybe there's something else going on under the spotlight where it's not necessarily mandated to report, but your judgment is saying that this kid is not ready for that. Then that is when you can call and consult with CPS and make a mandated report as well. But keeping in mind that if a kid under the age of 14, so if their 13-year-old has a partner that is 14 years or older, that is a mandated report no matter what. Also, sexual conduct of a person under 16 with a person of 21 years of age or older. And again, that little star is kind of there for you to kind of go and look at your guideline for that, because it will give you, a couple different like scenarios of what to look for, or what else is a mandated report, what's not a mandated report, right? But basically, you must report sexual conduct of a person under 16 with somebody who's 21 years old or older. Okay, that is a mandated report. Sexual conduct of 16 or 17 years old when possibility of abuse exists, right? So as we start getting into that older adolescent years, right, they are able to consent, again, keeping in mind that age limit, but any type of abuse exists, that is where you would need to make a report as well. Okay. And again, sometimes it's not always that black or white reporting, right? It gets a little confusing. So that's why I included that guide for you guys. If you have a minute after the training or during the training, you can pull it out, you can pull it up, look at it. And it specifically marks what's a mandated report and what's not. And it explains to you why it is or why it's not. So hopefully you guys find that helpful. But I know sexual abuse, especially when it comes to consensual activities between minors, can get a little bit cloudy, can get a little bit confusing, right? Okay, so we're going to jump ahead into emotional or mental abuse. So emotional abuse can be defined as any behaviors, speech, actions of parents, caregivers, or significant figures in a child's life that have negative mental impact on a child. So this is typically the most difficult type of abuse to identify and often to prove. Okay, so parents of an emotionally abused child will often blame the child for the problems or ignore the existence of a problem. Parents often refuse offers of help and appear punitive and unconcerned about the child's welfare. So that's kind of, some of those little red flags that you can pick up from if you have a relationship with the caregiver. So these are just some examples, because again, it's not always obvious of what's going on, but a parent might be rejecting or ignoring. So telling the child they're unwanted, unloved, showing little interest in the child, right? Those types of things. Terrorizing, so accusing, blaming, insulting, punishing, threatening, anything like that. Corrupting, so engaging a child in criminal acts, right? Using a child, or if a child witnesses it, that would be considered emotional abuse. Shaming or humiliating, so calling child names, criticizing, belittling, demanding, using language that, aims kind of at a child's self-worth. isolating, so confining a child to a small area, like forbidding a child to play, or engaging in other stimulating activities. So kind of using that as punishment or using that in inappropriate ways. What can you look for in kiddos, right? What are our warning signs? So a kid might seem excessively withdrawn, fearful, or anxious about doing something wrong. They show extremes in behavior, so they might be extremely compliant, or they might be extremely demanding. For example, they do not appear to be attached to the parent or caregiver. They might act either inappropriate adult-like or inappropriately infantile. Okay, so neglect. Neglect refers to negligent treatment or the maltreatment of a child by his or her caregiver that results in harm or could be harmful. Okay, so it includes both acts, right? So an act would be like, for example, locking a toddler in a hot car, or omission. So for example, not providing food or adequate clothing. Okay, child neglect can harm a child's self-esteem and sense of trust, delay them developmentally, and put them at harm for other types of abuse. Okay, and that is the reason why we as mandated reporters need to be aware and need to make the appropriate report. So a couple different categories of neglect would be general neglect, so failure of a caregiver to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, supervision. And severe neglect. So intentional failure of a caregiver to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Okay. And we'll talk about the different forms of neglect. So again, physical neglect would be not providing clothing, food, shelter, adequate supervision. Emotional would be not interacting with a child, not providing affection or attention. Medical neglect, not providing children with appropriate treatment for injuries and illness. Educational neglect, so parents actually have the responsibility to make sure that their children have access to opportunities for academic success. So not sending your kid to school, not enrolling them in some sort of program for them, that would actually fall under educational neglect. So what can we look for in our kiddos who potentially might be experiencing neglect? So clothes might be ill-fitting, filthy, or inappropriate for the weather. Hygiene is consistently bad. Untreated illnesses and physical injuries, frequently unsupervised or left alone, allowed to play in unsafe situations and environments, frequently late or missing school, constantly hungry, right? If they're not getting their needs provided for them. Okay, so jumping into our next section is making a report. So what happens when it happens, right? Like when a kiddo discloses to you or you need to make the necessary mandated report. Right. So again, those penal codes from CANRA kind of list out specific things that you as a mandated reporter need to do and specific laws. So you must make your report to the county welfare department or to any police, sheriff, or county probation department. Okay, so typically we use CPS or the local law enforcement agency of where it happened. Reporting suspected abuse to an employer, supervisor, school principal, school counselor, coworker, or another person is not a substitute for reporting to a child agency, right? And it does not fulfill the obligation to report. Again, just because you are reporting it to your supervisor doesn't mean that your supervisor is going to go and make that report, right? You are responsible. You are the person who has the relationship with the child. You are the person who heard what the child had to say. It is your responsibility to report and make sure that that report is done. Okay, we can't pass that responsibility on to someone else, unfortunately. No supervisor or administrator may impede or inhibit a report or subject the reporting person to any sanction, right? So if you're a supervisor for whatever reason, for some reason, or somebody at the school tells you, hey, I don't think that's reportable, it would be really bad light if you reported that, we don't really want authorities to get involved. That is actually illegal. They cannot stop you from making that report. You need to go and make that report anyway, no matter what their reasoning is. Okay, so what do we do? How do we make a mandated report? So mandated reports mandated reporters are required to make a report to CPS or law enforcement by phone immediately. So as soon as you hear of the abuse or neglect that's going on, you must make the report by phone immediately. You are then required to follow up with a written suspected child abuse report form and faxed to the agency within 36 hours of making the phone report. So that is another attachment that Christy emailed to you guys this morning as well, is the SCAR form. Okay, so you have to fill that entire form out, and then you must fax it from a confidential fax line. So for example, the fax that we have at the office, that is a perfect one to use. You can use that to fax it over to CPS or to law enforcement, whichever agency you called. When making a report, it's helpful to provide as much information as possible, but keep in mind that you might not have all the information, right? Again, that doesn't, just because you don't have all the information doesn't mean you don't make the report, okay? You are not an investigator, right? You are required to report any reasonable suspicion, and you do not need to take the steps to investigate, okay? You can call CPS and give them the information that you currently have. They might ask you for more information. It is totally appropriate to say, ooh, I didn't get, I didn't hear that, or the kid didn't tell me that yet, or I don't know, right? You can always call back when you gather more information, and you can always make another report on that case. Okay, investigating is the role of child protection investigators and law enforcement. They've been trained in how to minimize the trauma that an investigation and interview process may have on a child victim. Okay. So what am I required to put on this, when I make a report, or on this SCAR form? What are some things that CPS or law enforcement is going to ask for? So you're going to need the name and home addresses of the child or child's parents or caregivers, the child's birthday or approximate age. Remember, you might not have all the information, but you can give an approximate age if needed. The child's whereabouts. They'll also ask what school they go to, what grade they're in, the extent of the report and the injuries being reported, if any, the name, age, and condition of other children in the home, right? They want to know like how immediate the response needs to be, and if there's other children in the home. Identify the suspected abuser or perpetrator. Remember, we're using the word suspected because we don't know 100% what went on. We're just reporting what we were told by a child. And then they'll also be asking you for your name, address, and agency that you work for, okay? As a mandated reporter, you do actually have to give your name. That is not something that you can do anonymously. As somebody who is not a mandated reporter, actually can call in anonymously, but as mandated reporters, just keep in mind, they're gonna ask you your name and you do actually have to tell them. Okay, so what happens when you're talking with students? So I always suggest discuss mandated reporting laws with students upon your initial meeting with them, right? So when you are first meeting with a student, let them know I am a mandated reporter, right? Things that I appreciate, things that you tell me, but my goal as somebody who, cares about you and wants to work with you, my goal is to keep you safe. And in order to do that, I might have to make, phone calls to, the appropriate places, or I might have to talk to certain people in order to do that, right? So letting them know, use age appropriate verbiage, right? You're not going to talk to an elementary school kid about mandated reporting the same as you would with a high school student, right? Making sure that in any circumstance, if a kid starts to disclose something to you, you just want to be that person who's going to listen, right? Don't ask any or make sure that you do ask open-ended questions, right? Not closed. So ask, like, oh, what happened? Wow, that must be tough. Versus, who hit you? Or was it your dad who hit you? Or, why did your dad hit you, right? Because that starts to make assumptions, right? A kid has a bruise. We don't necessarily know that they were hit. So asking like, oh, what happens, allows the kid to explain the story without you as the mandated reporter kind of putting your input in on it or making assumptions, right? If the child's behavior is concerning to you, right? Make sure that you can ask the kid privately, not probably in front of their peers, give them a chance to kind of, open up to you. Ask privately if there's something going on, right? Or is there something I can help you with? Something like that. Again, not making the assumption that they're being abused, but just giving them a little bit of space where they can give you their story. So younger school age students, they might disclose something by accident, right? Anytime a child discloses anything, even if it's by accident or on purpose, make sure that you control your initial emotional response. right? Don't act shocked, don't act disgusted, don't act, like, oh, disapproval or anything like that. Remember that typically the child is being abused by somebody that they love, right? Whether it's somebody in their home, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a sports coach, a family friend, right? Not always, but typically it's somebody who's close to the child and they might still love them, right? And so if you kind of have this shocked response, or if you kind of have this response of, oh, that's disgusting, I can't believe that person would do that to you, that's not real love, right? You might, of course not on purpose, but you might shame that child, you might make them feel guilty, you might kind of instill those feelings in them, right? Or they might realize like, ooh, I probably shouldn't have disclosed this is not a safe situation for me. Okay, so try to control your own emotional response. Thank the student for trusting you with that information, right? Thank you so much. That sounds really tough. I'm going to help you in any way that I can, right? Thank you for sharing that with me. I know that must be tough to share. Remind children of your duty to report, right? That you have to make that report. You can even remind them, hey, remember when we first met, I told you my goal is to keep you safe. This is one of those times where I'm going to have to make that report, right? And again, just reminding you, it's not your job to investigate. You don't have to continue to press or ask questions. Just let the kid tell you their story, right? So just a couple common reasons why mandated reports are not made, even when they should be made, right? So keep in mind cultural factors, right? Every person has their own cultural factors. So the child and the reporters, sometimes we feel like that because something is normal for us, it should be normal for another person, right? That's not always the case. We all have what's considered to be our own normals. So don't let our culture or our normals kind of influence your decision on making a report. Personal feelings about making the report, right? Maybe it's uncomfortable. Maybe it's a really uncomfortable topic. Time restraints, making a report can take a while. You might be on hold with CPS for a little while. You do have to go and type up that form. You do have to submit that form within 36 hours. So sometimes we get a little bit like, I don't know. It wasn't really a black or white report. The kid's not like going to die. So maybe it can just wait, right? Not okay. Fear of retaliation. So maybe a mandated reporter doesn't know their full rights as a mandated reporter, right? Like all mandated reports are confidential. CPS is not allowed to disclose that you were the person who made the report. So maybe they're scared that the parent is going to, or the caregiver is going to retaliate. There's also maybe that fear of loss of relationship with the child. Maybe you've worked with this child for a really long time and you feel guilty, right? Like maybe you feel like you're betraying this child. Because you're telling this story, or maybe they don't want you to tell this story, right? Maybe they realize, oh, I forgot that you're a mandated reporter. Unfortunately, the protection of the child is always more important than your relationship with the child, right? Because again, it goes back to that early intervention of how can we help these children to grow up to be as healthy as they can. Okay, so we'll briefly talk about other circumstances that require mandated reports, or sometimes ones that we're not really exactly sure of what to do with. We'll just kind of briefly go through this section just for the sake of time. But we'll start with domestic or intimate violence. So CANRA doesn't exactly specify that this is something in the penal codes, but domestic violence is actually something that needs to be reported when a child is in the home. Okay, so when domestic or intimate partner violence results in direct physical injury to a child, a suspected child abuse report must be made. Also, you must make a report if a child witnesses domestic or intimate partner violence, because again, that goes back to those ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and that affects how a child's going to grow up, right? It also can be kind of seen as emotional abuse as well. Children in homes with domestic or intimate partner violence tend to be more aggressive or anxious, are less likely to succeed in school, and are higher risk for behavioral or attachment problems. So that's why, even if they're not experiencing injury from the domestic violence, even if they're just witnessing it or hearing it, that still needs to be a report. Parental substance abuse. So again, children are more likely to be subjected to abuse or neglect in homes where substance abuse occurs, and children can potentially be exposed to these substances as well. So whether it's intentional or unintentional, if you're hearing that there's substance abuse in the home, right, that needs to be a report made as well, because again, it goes back to the ACEs, it goes back to potential emotional neglect or abuse. So one topic that gets a little bit tricky is suicidal ideation and self-harm in minors. Right. So while not necessarily a mandated report, right, this isn't typically covered in mandated reporter training, but I thought to add it in here today, just because I feel that it's a really important topic. And it's also something that's becoming more relevant as we're working with youth, right? Suicide rates and suicide statistics we're seeing are constantly changing and constantly rising. So not necessarily a mandated report. However, keep in mind that abuse or neglect that may contribute to suicidal thoughts or self-harming behaviors, right? So again, it goes back to that ACEs. It goes back to how abuse or neglect might impact a child's self-esteem, right? Or emotional mood, or how they feel about themselves, right? Well, all of those things potentially could link to suicidal thoughts, right? So if you're hearing a kid, kind of express to you that maybe they're having some passive suicidal thoughts, that potentially could be a red flag for a mandated report, because there might be other types of abuse going on, right? Also, your goal as a mandated reporter is to keep a kid safe. So while maybe it's not necessarily a mandated report, it's important to follow your agency or school's protocol in accordance with your role when working with minors who are reporting suicidal ideation or self-harming behaviors, right? So again, it's kind of that sticky line. As a therapist, personally, we do have to report if somebody's going to be a harm to themselves or another person. I know there are other roles of, mentors, teachers, right? Like school staff members. Maybe they don't all follow under the exact same reporting guidelines, but your number one goal as a mandated reporter is to keep that kid safe. Right. And how are we going to do that? So knowing a protocol or having a protocol in mind of what you need to do if a kid is reporting to you that they are suicidal or that they are self-harming is going to be exactly what you need to do. And sometimes school intervention might be necessary. Sometimes law enforcement might be necessary. Sometimes parents might be necessary. Right. And so just having a plan in advance, knowing what to do kind of in those situations, following your agency or your school's protocol. Okay. Keeping in mind as well, right? Sometimes self-harming behaviors does not always mean that a child is suicidal, right? Like sometimes kids might harm themselves. They might cut, right? They might use a razor blade. They might, kind of burn themselves with a cigarette, but they might do these things as a coping skill. But again, keep in mind, immediate intervention is important for the purpose, for purpose or accidental serious health reasons, right? A kid might accidentally cut too deep. A kid's cuts might get infected. Maybe they use a rusty razor blade, right? So again, even if there's not that intent of suicide, your number one goal is to keep that kid safe. And so talking to the kid about that, right? Letting them know, hey, like we need to talk to somebody about this. We need to get you a higher level of care, right? We need to get you some sort of support, right? If you feel like you're not the person to do those types of things. Okay, wrapping up. So just a couple last minute notes. Not to scare anybody, but it is listed in the penal code. A mandated reporter who fails to make a required report is guilty of a misdemeanor punishable by up to 6 months in jail or a $1,000 fine. Okay. If you are ever in doubt, if you don't know, if you think you have reasonable suspect, or you're like, I just can't remember exactly what Courtney said in that training, and maybe your gut is just kind of like, oh, I don't know, consult, right? You can call CPS just to consult with a social worker and ask, hey, is this something that I need to report? Hey, this is something that's going on. And the social worker is more than happy to say, yes, this is a mandated report. You need to make the report now. Or they will say, you need, like, not quite yet, as more information comes up, you probably are going to need to call back and make that report at a later time. Okay. So if in doubt, consult. Keep in mind the child's confidentiality, right? So be mindful of who you're talking to. If you're kind of looking for a little bit of advice from a supervisor or a coworker, something like that, totally fine. But keep, the kid and what they're telling you to a minimum, right? Don't disclose everything. Mandated reporters have absolute immunity from state criminal or civil liability for reporting as required. So as long as the report that you have made is in good faith, you are not liable for any type of state criminal or civil liability, right? That is a law in California. The penal code also goes to talk more and more about that as well too, okay? Reporting agencies are required to cross-report to each other. It's not the job of the mandated reporter to do so. So sometimes we don't know, should we call Child Protective Services? Should we call law enforcement? We don't really know who to call. But if you call CPS and it needs to actually go to law enforcement for them to do the investigation, it is CPS's job to call law enforcement and let them know. That is what is called cross-reporting, okay? You as the mandated reporter did your job. You called CPS, you made the report, you faxed in your form. It is their job to cross-report, okay? If for some reason you're working with a kid and 2 or more people who are required to report jointly have knowledge of a known or suspected instance of child abuse or neglect, the report can be made by one person, okay, as long as you are certain that that selected person to make the report actually did so, right? So maybe that means you're sitting in the room with them while they do it, but it doesn't have to be both people. Any member who has knowledge that the member designated to report has failed to do so shall then make the report. So if you are working with a student and you have another person involved and you guys both know that the CPS report needs to be made, and maybe that person says, oh yeah, I'll do it, I'll do it tomorrow, or I'll do it later this week, I'm really busy right now. Well, guess what? Mandated reporters, right, have to report within like immediately and fax in that form 36 hours. So you are now knowing that that person has failed to make a report. So now it is your responsibility to do so. Okay. And here is just a nice list of resources for you guys. Again, the SCAR form, Christy emailed to you this morning that I can email you guys that link as well, because it's kind of long actually, but that goes directly to all the penal codes of all the of what the state specifically says you have to report, right? And there is a Stanislaus County Child Protective Services phone number right there. Okay, so that phone number, I actually even have it just in my cell phone as a contact, because when I need it, and so when you need to call them, you have it readily available to you. You don't have to be searching online or saying, oh, how do I get, the phone call or the phone number? You have it right there. So I would recommend putting that in your phone, especially if you're going to be on different sites working with kids. You don't know if you're always going to have access to internet or, your computer or something like that. So please put that in there. Otherwise, Christy has emailed you guys with the SCAR form. That is the form that has to be faxed in. And she also included that sexual activity between minors form or kind of chart for you guys. So, all right. Thank you for your time. I think I went over time by quite a bit, so I apologize, but I felt like that was all the necessary and relevant information that needed to be included.
You didn't. You did a fabulous job. I have one quick question, and then we'll open it for everybody else. This number to the Child Protective Services, is that the same number that I would call if I needed to consult and say, hey, is this? So it's the same number.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
And it's actually a different phone number than what's listed on, like if you were to just kind of do a quick Google search and type in like Stanislaus County, like welfare services, they have a different number because I think it goes to like their main like office area. Even if you call that number, like they'll route you to CPS, but this is like CPS's direct number.
Perfect.
And it's a 24-hour line. So even if you're meeting with students after hours, usually what they'll do is you call, they'll kind of take down your information and your phone number, and then they have the on-call CPS worker call you back. So 24-hour line. Even if you're working with students at like 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, maybe you're doing it like a group or something, you still have to make that report immediately. You don't wait until the next day.
Awesome. Guys, we are going to answer some questions, but I am going to stop the recording for right now. Thank you so much, Courtney. You did a phenomenal job.